We think it's a conspiracy, but it's much, much worse. It's a consensus.
The post-war consensus, what we got wrong in that consensus.
1939 was a long, long time ago. Yet it exerts this incredible grip on our political and moral imagination. And that really begs for explanation.
Why is it that J.K. Rowling, who has been called a transphobe, why is it that she's also called a Nazi? That makes no sense. What has that got anything to do with her opinions on gender? I think your theory sort of explains why.
So it turns out that almost the entire Western philosophical tradition is implicated in Auschwitz. You know, I look at Karl Popper's book, The Open Society and Its Enemies. Karl Popper identifies truth as a strong God that has to be driven out. Why did my professors have no capacity to defend the things that they actually loved? They couldn't hold on to Shakespeare, Plato, Aristotle. All these things are deployed by our elite to keep the old consensus going.
Before you hear from R.R. Reno or Rusty Reno, I ask if you want to support this show. All you have to do is press subscribe. If you do that, I can have more phenomenal guests like Rusty Reno exploring the issues you want to hear about and that the mainstream media won't touch. And go over to winstonmarshall.co.uk if you want exclusive videos, content, and interviews. But without further ado, R.R. Reno. R.R. Reno, Rusty Reno, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. If I can maybe explain why I'm so excited about your work and why I was just giddy by the idea of you coming out, which I don't want to butter you up too much when we talk, but
that seems implausible.
I mean, you ask William, the producer. So I'll tell you why, because on this show we talk a lot about populism, and I think that no one, whether you like populism or not, whatever your definition of populism might be, everyone pretty much agrees now that populism is a worldwide phenomenon and that we're in it. It's not an aberration like we thought it might be in 2016 with Brexit and Trump.
Yes.
We're seeing it with Javier Milei in Argentina, Bukele in Salvador. Of course, here we're in America, Trump, but in Europe, in my country, there are populists, whether it was the left-wing populists of Corbyn, or you might say Reform UK and Nigel Farage are populists. On the continent, Orban denies he's a populist, but some people would say he is. Meloni, I'm not sure if she would identify it as it, but there is a national populist, maybe you call it national conservative movement, that is worldwide and that seems to be against the globalist world order. And I had accepted for a while what I thought was maybe the best analysis of what was going on was Steve Bannon's analysis. Whatever you think of Steve Bannon, whatever you think about what he prescribes for the future, that's not exactly necessarily what I was interested in. It was his analysis that after the Wall Street bailout, the $1 trillion Wall Street bailout, after the failed wars that cost trillions in the Middle East, the neocon wars, and after globalization opening up trade, particularly to China from the 90s onward, this had a negative effect on a lot of people. But
they were just symptoms, those failures.
It
turns out, yeah, not causes.
According to your thesis, which is what we're going to get into, your thesis, your theory, ties into the things I think that theory missed, which was things like environmental madness, things like, I would say, the Marxism, the neo-Marxism we've been seeing in universities. I would even say the rise in censorship, the rise, the dealings. I'll try and argue in this conversation, the British Pakistani rape gangs, I think, is going to be tied into this. That, for me, maybe best summed up is, why is it that J.K. Rowling, who has been called a transphobe, now, I don't think she's transphobic at all, but why is it that she's also called a Nazi? That makes no sense. What has that got anything to do with her opinions on gender? But I think your theory sort of explains why. And I guess you explain it all in The Return of the Strong Gods.
Right.
Nationalism, Populism, and the Future of the West. And you explain it clearly there. But perhaps that theory starts with the post-war consensus, and by post-war, I mean post-Second World War consensus, and what we got wrong in that consensus. Now, love to know what you think of my introduction there. But if you accept that introduction, perhaps we can start with the post-war consensus and what that was, that is the sort of roots of everything we're now seeing flourish across the world.
The fact that Rowling is denounced as a Nazi, it's a fascinating phenomenon. It was a long time ago. 1939 was a long, long time ago. There really are increasingly, I guess there's still a few men left who fought in World War II, but they're over 100 years old now. And the vast majority of people living in Europe and the United States were born long after the events of 1939, 1945. Yet it exerts this incredible grip on our political and moral imagination. And that really begs for explanation. Joe Biden's final State of the Union speech in 2024, January of 2024, he evoked at the very first couple paragraphs Franklin Roosevelt and Adolf Hitler, the great conflict. And, I thought about it and thought that would be like Franklin Roosevelt giving a State of the Union speech evoking Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederate States of America, and Robert E. Lee, or Ulysses S. Grant. And that would be unimaginable. So what happened? Why does Adolf Hitler, to use him as a kind of condensed symbol for all that stuff, or I use Auschwitz as the condensed symbol, why does that maintain such a powerful grip on our imaginations? And my thesis in the book, it's a simple historical thesis, is that to an extent that we really underestimate, 1914 to 1945 was a civilizational catastrophe in the West. Americans, World War II was a good war. We won. But I think for people in Great Britain, there's a historical memory that World War I was, it was it put an end to any kind of, the class system, what was left of this aristocratic privilege and things like that. As Robert Graves titled his memoir of the war and its aftermath, his title was Goodbye to All That. Says it all. So, but I think we don't realize the extent to which 1914 then rolls on, global depression, Weimar Republic, Spanish Civil War, this feeling that that liberal modernity was kaput. And then we had to choose between either fascism or communism. And then it explodes into this great war that even of a far vaster scale, with far greater destruction than World War I, culminating in the revelations of the Holocaust, 6 million dead, and 2 nuclear bombs dropped on cities in Japan. And people, smart, responsible people, Americans and Brits, really wanted to think about what went wrong. And we developed as a culture in the West, it was an Anglo-American consensus that was in turn imposed upon Germany and to a lesser extent France, that the terrible catastrophes of these decades arose from the fact that men were swept up by terrible ideological passions, and that the key to a future without, prevent never again Hitler, never again Auschwitz, we had to dial down the temperature of civic life. And these passions I describe as the strong gods, or the objects of our passion are the strong gods. These are the things that really rouse our intense sense of loyalty.
So sorry, the things that were identified as wrong were the strong gods.
People were too passionate. And so too much ideological fervor, too much nationalism. Nationalism became a bad word in the post-war era. And, I look at Karl Popper's book, The Open Society, and its enemies. Very important to have the Manichaean good versus evil, friends versus enemies template. And it turns out that one of the great enemies of the Open Society is Plato. And if you look and you read, it's a very detailed kind of attack on Plato, the first volume of Open Society and Its Enemies. But be that as it may, Karl Popper identifies truth as a strong God that has to be driven out of society. We need to have meaning, not truth.
So
and meaning's a soft word, so it's a hard word. Can you compromise on truth?
No.
Can you compromise on meaning? Well, you have your meaning, I have my meaning.
But he flipped it the other way around.
He wanted us to have a society based on meaning, not truth, because meaning is a weak God, so to speak, and truth is a strong God. He's very explicit about that.
A quick interruption from our sponsor. Using Ground News, let's take a quick look at how the media is reporting on Trump's first 100 days back in office. Left-leaning El País ran the headline, "Trump completes 100 days of revenge and consummated threats." Now let's use Ground News to see how the rest of the media is covering this story. We specifically partnered with Ground News because their app and website allow me and my team to quickly see through media bias and get the full picture on any news story. There are multiple articles published on Trump's first 100 days, and we can access every single one on Ground News with context on each source. Interestingly, only 15% of left-leaning outlets are covering this story. Meanwhile, right-leaning Daily Wire ran the headline, "Just Getting Started. Trump vows more action in 100 days of greatness rally." A very different narrative from El País. Seeing all sides, regardless of political lean, is essential for making informed decisions and spotting bias. That's why Ground News' blind spot feed, which highlights stories underreported by either side, is such a powerful tool. I genuinely believe in what Ground News is doing, and I encourage you to check it out by scanning the QR code or visiting ground.news/Winston. If you subscribe through my link, you'll get 40% off unlimited access. Ground News is subscriber funded, and by supporting my sponsors, you are supporting this show. Thank you, and back to the interview. We have to talk about Popper because I think it's a very significant part of this. But how would
he calls Platonism an oracular philosophy? That is to say that we see the truth, and then in seeing it, we're bewitched, and our heart, we cannot help but be loyal to the truth that we see. I mean, that's essentially, the cave allegory, that you turn from your world of mere appearances, and you look to the light, and you see things as they truly are. Now then, Plato says you have to turn and go back into the cave and try to bring the denizens of the cave to some better understanding of what is really, really true. But that's the philosopher. The philosopher is the one who has has glimpsed at the true, the good, and the beautiful. And Popper says, no. That is the root of totalitarianism.
Sorry, I want to get into Popper, but how did he define meaning?
Meaning is what we make. He's very explicit in one of the passages in Open Society and Its Enemies that we have to just simply accept the fact that history has no meaning and accept what we give to it. And so we have to be kind of double-minded. We know that we have to have purpose in life, but we have to know that that purpose is self-constructed, even as we accept it as our purpose. And I think that's very much the history of the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, into this present. It's not that we live in an aimless society. We have purposes and so on, but we're socialized to see that these purposes are socially constructed or they're personally affirmed. They're not given on Mount Sinai.
What would be an example of that, like a specific example of a meaning from the 50s, 60s, 70s?
Well, Albert Camus was a great figure in the 50s, won the Nobel Prize in 1957, I think. And I think his popularity and the reason why he was honored is because he articulated an account of to be honestly human is to acknowledge the fact that there is no providential, eternal, transcendent truth. And that we live in a world that's meaningless, and the meaning is what we give to it, to our choices, our decisions, our loyalties.
And this is sort of pre-postmodernist?
Yes.
Right. Or is it postmodernist?
Well, it was pre-postmodernist in the sense that it's before Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault. And
but they built on that?
Yes. I mean, I think they're representatives of the Open Society consensus. But look at Popper. So we think, anti-Western ideology. Where does that come from? Well, you read Karl Popper, who's the great enemy of the Open Society? Plato.
Mm.
What figure is the foundation of the Western philosophical tradition? Plato. So it turns out that almost the entire Western philosophical tradition is implicated in Auschwitz, according to Popperian thinking. I'm being hyperbolic, but not that much. He's got very strong language in Open Society and Its Enemies. It's very clear, like I say, with the notion of enemies. So Plato's an enemy of a future that we want to construct in the West in order to avoid the catastrophic conflicts and terrible death and destruction.
Yeah.
So it's then next thing you know, fast forward, you're, at University of London, and you're taking classes on post-colonialism and other things. There's a straight line from Popper to these anti-Western ideas. He would be horrified, of course.
I'm not sure
he didn't fully understand,
I
think, the implications of what he was driving at. I think he took for granted the ballast in our tradition. I look at this Harvard committee. It was formed in 1943. The president of Harvard was the civilian head of the Manhattan Project, and so in Stalingrad, Battle of Stalingrad was in summer of 1943. So obviously he's very well informed about global affairs, and really the Battle of Stalingrad, that was anybody who, our war planners recognized that this meant that the Soviet Union would ultimately drive the German army into Berlin and destroy it. So we knew that we were going to win, so to speak, in 1943. And so he formed a committee to basically think through what should education emphasize in the reconstruction of the West. And the title of their report was Education for a Free Society. And they tried to strike a balance between the authority of tradition, the canon, the great books. They did not chuck out Plato, on the contrary, had to grapple with the great books of the Western tradition. But there had to be openness for students to question it, query it, challenge it. And so this nice, delicate balance between the authority of tradition, which is a strong God, and this openness motif, where they tried to strike a balance. But it was foredoomed because all of the prestige, all of the precedent and all of the energy went towards the critical questioning, the open side of things. So it gains momentum. And then by the time you get to the 1980s, in American higher education, you have the so-called canon wars. Hey ho, Western civs got to go, as Jesse Jackson chanted on Stanford University campus. And indeed it went. And so by the time you get to the 90s and the aughts, you have openness overturning and really expelling any residual form of a strong God. That's to say, an authoritative tradition.
Dead white males is the thing you hear from.
Yeah, so we tend to look at feminism and dead white males, and I mean, there's lots to think about. But I tried to get at why was it that my professors, I went to university in 1979. Why did my professors have no capacity to defend the things that they actually loved? They couldn't hold on to Shakespeare, Plato, Aristotle. And I did. I had professors who were educated and they loved what they taught. And they gave way to the generation that followed them, baby boomers, and then subsequent next generation that ultimately had this kind of critical acid that disintegrated everything. And why they had no antibodies? Because they believed the open society consensus.
Yeah. So let's just go back to, just for people who are new to this, right? So I want to come to Popper, but just on strong gods, have you got a short sort of definition of strong gods as you use that term?
They're the objects of our most profound loves and deepest loyalties.
So it's a metaphysical...
It's a metaphor for everything from, your adolescent falling in love for the first time to patriotic love to love of God. And it's not just the fiery love of Eros, but it's also the calmer love of a familiar place.
Okay.
I mean, it's funny, home, I emphasize the notion of home in this book later on. Home, people are from you could be from some shitty town in, post-industrial England, and you could fully acknowledge that the place is pretty devastated, but you still love home. It's not eros, but it's this deep human need to be loyal to your place.
And the opposite of strong gods, is that reason?
No, reason is very strong God, because it ultimately fixes on the truth. And it clears away falsehood for the sake of truth. So I would not put reason as a strong God.
What would you put
God,
as an opposite?
Weak God. No, there's what I mean, my friend said, well, wait a minute. They're not weak gods. Look at political correctness. It can be pretty punitive. And I said, okay, maybe we'll call them the gods of weakening. And so is skepticism the same as reason? I don't think so. But there are therapeutic notions of self-acceptance that became very strong in the post-war era. It's a weak God, or God of weakening.
Okay.
Be true to yourself. Because it turns out that follow your dreams. Well, they're kind of ever changing. So it's a dispersed, flat God. Liberalism generally as a utility is a weak God. So if you're a Benthamite utilitarian, you're urging people to say, dampen those passions. Stop thinking about these higher things that you're going to be. Think more about like concrete, like how's your health? I mean, so I think of what I call the hearth gods of health, wealth, and pleasure as being weak gods. I mean, they can bewitch, to be sure, as we know. Mammon is very powerful in his own way. But does it raise your eyes above the horizon? No.
So let's talk about Popper, because I think this is really fundamental to everything. You describe the dichotomy that he creates, the open societies and its enemies, the closed societies. Now, just for listeners, who haven't read necessarily Popper or aren't familiar, the open societies and its enemies, it's mainly a philosophical work. So focusing on Plato, like you say, Hegel,
and then Marx.
And Marx. He really doesn't like Plato. He really doesn't like Hegel. And I would say he gives a total apologist account of Marx, who he might criticize some of what Marx said, but he says Marx had good intentions. And
he was a socialist in his youth in Vienna.
Right. He speaks glowingly about Marx in a way that's very shocking to read. That was written in 1944. So read now, I think, after everything we know about the Soviet Union. Maybe you'd say Popper didn't know everything that was going on there. But I think if you read Marx straight, that he's clearly biased, particularly given how damning he is of Hegel and Plato before. For him to speak that way about Marx is kind of shocking, to me anyway. And in this book, he creates this dichotomy, and in the open societies, he throws the good things, which are liberalism, freedom, democracy, and on the other side, as well as fascism and totalitarianism, Nazism, he also throws in nationalism, which I think he writes off as a sort of metaphysical hocus pocus thing, and he puts religion in there.
Yes.
Which is really key, I think, to understanding this dichotomy that was created by Popper. Popper saw the book as his war effort. He was, I think, an Austrian Jew who had emigrated to New Zealand during the war, and this was his way of never again. And,
it was
rightly, by the way, never again. So,
it was his big. There's a whole series of these books, What Went Wrong books.
Yes.
And other one I look at is Friedrich Hayek's Road to Serfdom.
Yes.
And, Karl Polanyi's The Great Transformation. Most people don't realize that the first 3 chapters are actually what went wrong and what led to the war, the World War II. So there's a whole, a really good book. Then after the war, you have Hannah Arendt, Origins of Totalitarianism. You've got Erich Fromm, Escape from Freedom. That was written in the 30s, but it's in that same genre. There's a good book to be written that looks at all of these mid-20th century books that are trying to figure out what went wrong. Because I think it's part of my thesis. And I think my thesis is that, and I just want to really emphasize this, this events, 1914 and 1945, were as catastrophic as the wars of religion in the 16th and 17th, early 17th century, which had a transformative effect on the political and cultural shape of Europe. And are we surprised that these events from the first half of the 20th century, are we to be surprised that they have also had a profound transformative effect on Western civilization? We should beware. So a lot of what we're suffering from, it could be radical decline in fertility. It could be the general sense of malaise, the feeling of being at a dead end, which is very pervasive, actually, more so in Europe than the United States. All these things are, I think, natural. I mean, they're not natural. They're kind of to be expected, a kind of post-traumatic stress disorder that's affected the West for the last 3 generations, for 80 years. And we're in a sort of, what's happening is that the people, there are a certain percent, not a majority, but a growing plurality of people in the West are rebelling against this imprisonment, if you will, in the 20th century. We don't live in, it's not 19, contrary to what Anne Applebaum wants you to believe, it's not always 1939. And that maybe the Churchill metaphor is just the right one for the war in Ukraine. And, maybe it's time to bury Adolf Hitler, and maybe we should tell the Germans that it's stop already with your anti-Nazi ideology, and come to grips with the reality of your country in 2025. We do not live in societies that are consolidating around passionate ideologies. We live in disintegrating societies.
Just on that, they're not wrong to be anti-Nazi. It's not what you're saying. It's that they're wrong to code everything as if it's Nazi.
I would even say they're wrong to be anti-Nazi. I mean, at some point, you should stop trying to solve the problems that don't exist.
Right. Okay. So you think it's just a problem that's like non-existent?
I'd look at Germany and I would say, odds are, far from consolidating around blood and soil, the odds are very strong it won't even exist as a country in the next generation. It's a coherent country in the next generation. And I think the same thing's true of Great Britain. It could very well be the case that if you stay on the same trajectory of demographic change, low fertility, and general attack on any attempt to reconsolidate the country around some sort of shared mythos, which is what you have in Great Britain. Then why wouldn't you, by the time you get to 2050, the country is effectively disintegrated. I mean, it may continue to exist as a legal entity, but and this is what J.D. Vance was trying to get at in his Munich speech, his Munich Security Conference speech, which is that, I mean, you look at polling in Germany and you get 80% of German youth saying they won't fight for their country. I mean, how can you have a functional country is it really a country if people say, okay, you can come, you can rape our women, you can kill our youths, that's okay. We're not going to fight back. That's not a country. That's a conglomeration of individuals. I mean, St. Augustine identified the race and the res publica, the thing that makes a mass into a people are shared loves. And so you have to ask yourself, I mean, is the NHS enough of a shared love to unite make for a people? Now, to some extent, it's a kind of, to me, that is it's a trivialization of a deep Christian impulse to care for the weak and the vulnerable. And that is a shared love. And that's a shared commitment. That's a residual effect of Christianity. And I don't want to mock and it's easily mocked, but I would say if I'm in Great Britain, we want to blow on the embers of that love.
Yes.
Make it stronger. Make it more than just a bureaucratic operation.
Yeah, I'm keen to. This is something I've been thinking about.
And then
a lot.
Same thing for the United States. We have a very dangerous country here in the United States because it's the most militaristic country in the world, and it's got a very strong undercurrent of rabid patriotism, that compensates for our relative lack of deep culture. American culture, it's very shallow but very wide.
Yeah.
And so what provides Americans with a strong sense of unity is this intense patriotic commitment. The flag. Don't you notice it when you're in the United States, all the flags?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
It's kind of, some of my continental European friends find it kind of
crass and yeah.
No, they find it frightening.
Oh, actually frightening.
Yes.
The question of nationalism is...
But so that's what I would say is that, look, we need to, as Americans, that's one reason that a larger number of blacks and Hispanics voted for Trump, is they want to live in a great country.
Yes, right.
I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, they want to live in a great country that they're proud of. I remember I was in a car driving to JFK. This driver, this Jewish guy from Azerbaijan, would come to the United States right after the fall of the Soviet Union, and he was a U.S. citizen. He was going to vote. I said, "Who are you going to vote for in the primary?" So primaries, 2016, Trump.
Yeah.
And I said, "Come on, you can't vote for Trump. Isn't he anti-immigrant?" Playing the devil's advocate. And he said, "I don't want my children to grow up in a country that doesn't get respected."
Yeah.
And so that, again, is that superficial? I mean, it can be. Is it dangerous? To be sure, nationalism can become very disordered. But the alternative is to have a society where it's just a commercial agreement managed by technocrats who distribute utilities on our behalf. And we're not a country at all. We're not a people. So you have to be united around shared laws in order to have a nation, in a true sense of that word.
Before we carry on with nationalism, I just...
Sorry to go on so
No, I'm keen to talk about nationalism. I think it's a really important part of the whole story and theory. But just so it's absolutely clear, I don't want it to be anyone to take what you said. And so I understand what you said about the Nazi aspect. I just wanted to be clear what you're saying. It's that...
Stop giving chemotherapy to the patient. You're going to kill the patient. You're giving chemotherapy for a cancer that doesn't really exist anymore.
Right. Okay.
And maybe it will reemerge. Well, okay, let's deal with it when it comes back. But right now, anti-Nazi, anti-racism, anti-xenophobia, anti-nationalism, all these things are deployed by our elite to keep the old consensus going. And the old consensus is the open society consensus. Tony Blair, wow, that guy...
He's the ultimate ideologue.
Oh, unbelievable.
Except for George Soros, but we'll come back to him later.
Well, I have more sympathy for George Soros. He's got good reasons to hold on to the open society consensus he's of an age to have endured the things that that caused Popper to write his book. But Tony Blair, it is pure ideology. I mean, he really does think that people voted for Brexit because they're fearful of openness. I think he actually said that.
Huh. Yeah, and he's the one who began the mass immigration into Britain that was turbocharged in the last few years by the Conservative Party. But yeah, a lot of it is his fault. The nationalism, there's a famous, I don't know if he's famous actually, but Hans Kohn was part of the Popper school of thought who wrote a book on nationalism in 1944. I think it's called The Ideal of Nationalism. And he creates a dichotomy where it's civic nationalism. There's two types of nationalism, civic nationalism or ethno-nationalism.
Right. And
so in the civic nationalism, it's basically administratively, you share a territory with someone and you're some sort of political union. But there's nothing about the sort of metaphysical aspects of nationalism, the cultural aspects of nationalism that keep each other together. All of that is lumped into the ethno-nationalism bad. And it's another goody-baddie dichotomy.
Yeah, so civic nationalism is very deracinated.
Yes.
And pretty bloodless. I think, if you're Finnish, I think ethno-nationalism makes sense. If you're American, it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. Yeah. And then there are lots of countries that are in between. I'm not opposed to ethno-nationalism. I'm opposed to it in the United States because it's completely alien to our traditions. But like I say, if you're Finnish, I mean, to want the Finnish language and people to survive is a noble desire. If you're Estonian, Lithuanian, these are like tiny countries.
Well, Japan is often cited. Now,
And Japan is
70% of nations are based on have an ethno sort of core.
I mean, it can be punitive, or it can be welcoming. I mean, you know, in other words, again, I mean, you have to just look at the traditions of these places, and the duty of good leadership is to encourage the very best and the most noble aspects of these national and ethnic traditions, so that they overcome the worst aspects. And what Popper's solution, and it's been the Open Society consensus, is just tamp down the impulse to love things passionately. What I've learned from reading St. Augustine and observing life, that false loves can only be conquered by true loves. They cannot be conquered by critical reason, or kind of, you know, some sort of reductive dismantling or deconstruction.
On the ethno,
because we're made for love.
Yes.
And so we're going to, I think a lot of woke religion is a kind of surrogate for, you know, a true religion in the broad sense. I mean, for true and noble loyalties and loves and passions to commit yourself to make sacrifices for, to unite with others, to try to achieve.
I just want to keep pushing on the ethno-nationalism aspect, because likewise for Britain, an ethno-nationalism doesn't make sense because we're a multi-ethnic society. But for me, what's key, even for, let's say, the Finnish or the Japanese examples, it's actually the ethnos rather than the blood, the ethnicity, that's really key. Because actually they could be the same ethnicity but have completely different gods or completely different concepts of their own nation, and then they wouldn't be a nation anymore. And
you're kind of a Shia versus Sunni.
Yes, exactly. Perfect example. For that reason, it seems to me that the ethno-nationalism, it's what's actually key is that you have a shared culture and a shared sense of mythos. Yes. And the problem my country, Britain's having at the moment, is because of mass migration, and it's happening at such a speed that the opportunity, I don't see how we can integrate and assimilate these people into a shared culture. Now, in America, it seems to me that you've been able to have a multi-ethnic society and country because actually you have a meta ethnos, a meta culture that actually unifies the Americans. So, you know, not only the Declaration of Independence. Over time, it
dissolves
It takes a couple of, yes.
But it does dissolve it. I mean, it's interesting that I used to teach as a theology professor, and I had students, you know, who were like first-generation Thai or first-generation Vietnamese, and the parents had come hoping to expose their children to all the benefits of this country, you know, economic, so on, assuming that they could pass on all of their family and ethnic sensibilities, but their children were stolen from them by pop American culture, for good and for ill. You know, I think there's a lot of raw sewage in the American cultural system, as you know. But there's also other things. So, but the point being that, yes, I agree with you. We have a much, I'm an American optimist in this regard. You can't have people, we're at 15% non-native born in the United States now after this big long surge of immigration. And that was the same level when we shut immigration down in the 1920s. There's probably, a sociologist could probably speculate about at what point does a society lose coherence? 20%, 25%. You know, the Swedes are, I think, at 20% non-native born.
But it's still the case, though, with America that
But we don't have an infinite capacity, my point being, right?
As in, you couldn't just have open borders and have everyone here.
Right. And that's a kind of, part of what multiculturalism was. And here I got to say that both Barack Obama and Tony Blair and others, it was like putting lipstick on the pig. You know, you got demographic change, mass migration. It's like, wow. And there's economic drivers that are requiring it. And it just seemed impossible to restrain. So you redefine it as a blessing rather than as a challenge.
Well,
right? Don't you see? It's kind of very tempting.
They're definitely doing that, which is why they hammer diversity is our greatest strength. They keep hammering that. Now, I'm of the belief that unity is our greatest strength.
Correct. That's my line as well.
Unity without some diversity is also a problem. And maybe that's the strong gods going too far in the other direction. So we need some diversity, but actually without unity, it's chaos.
Right. And I think not just chaos, but you have to have a democratic society, you need to have trust. You have to trust that when the other side takes power, they won't dispossess you, and that there's a possibility of loyal opposition. And that requires civic friendship. And civic friendship emerges when there's, as you've described, as shared mythos. Like, I know I'm totally opposed to you on these policy questions, but I trust that you're pulling in the same direction generally that I'm pulling in.
Yes.
And then I can sit on the, in the opposition benches and without thinking of you as my enemy. You're my political adversary, but we're both fellow citizens.
No, see, now it seems to me that America's really lost in that because there's no longer a trust, even certainly in the political realm. If you look at, let's say, the State of the Union speech and the difference between the Democrats and Republicans, if you want an illustration of this, they do not trust that each other's opposite sides want the best for each other and for the country.
What I try to get at in the book is to help people see that the Open Society Consensus took on this tremendous prestige and power, and that we're coming to the end of its ability to shape the civic imagination of the West. And so part of the polarization is ongoing loyalty to the Open Society Consensus against this increasing dissent, populist dissent. And that feels like, that's why you talk about Trump or violating constitutional norms. If you dig down in that, often he's violating open society norms, or he's violating rules-based international order. There's lots of results. Or the civil rights regime that emerged in the United States in the 1960s has a legal aspect, but also has a cultural aspect. So when he attacks DEI, he's attacking kind of late-stage open society consensus apparatus.
Well, that's how it's coded by his opposition. The open...
Yeah, so he says that's fascist.
Yeah, because they can't, and this is again why J.K. Rowling is coded as fascist.
So you take a very late expression of the Open Society Consensus, and it has behind it all of the rhetorical energy of Karl Popper, Open Society's enemies. And so that's why Hitler, Stalin, there was an article by Ann Applebaum, Donald Trump is Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini, Franco, all rolled into one. Pol Pot, let's throw him in there too. And I think that's an attempt to transform the current political struggle over both it's a cultural as well as a political legal struggle in the United States, to turn that, to return it to that Manichaean moment of 1945, where we got to put the West on a whole new foundation. And here you got forces that are at work in Europe and the United States that are rejecting that project, the Open Society project. And by doing that, if you believe the Open Society, oh my God, these people are paving the way for the return of Hitler.
Yes, they can't code it any other way.
And so that then it is very difficult then to have to go back to a more healthy kind of kind of political contestation that's not a sort of deep, almost metaphysical contestation. I mean, I quote Richard Weaver in the book that men have specific, they have specific facts, general principles, and at the third level, they have metaphysical dreams. And we have a contestation of metaphysical dreams. The metaphysical dream of the Open Society is its diversity is our strength, so therefore more, better. The more porous things are. I can tell you, if you tell me what your view is on transgender ideology, I can tell you what your view is on illegal immigration. I mean, if the border between men and women is artificial, then surely the border between Mexico and the United States is artificial.
Quiet.
In fact, I could probably tell you, if as a Catholic, if your view on altar rails, I can tell you your view on transgenderism and your view on immigration. Borders are all about borders.
Oh, that's so interesting.
And if you look at Trump 2016, his big campaign meme was a big, beautiful wall. And I mean, it was a fundamental transgression against the open society consensus. Even if you were a kind of center-left person who had some regrets about, the fact that the border enforcement probably should be more stringent. But as soon as somebody stands up and says, I'm going to build a wall, all you can hear is he's rejecting like the fundamental project that we've been undertaking for the last 3 generations.
Yes. It's curious to see it in America, because in Europe, and you alluded to this at the right beginning of the conversation, is after the war on the continent, certainly, one of the big lessons was nationalism is bad. Nationalism created this. It's curious that in Britain we learned that lesson as well. We seem to have taken that lesson, and I think maybe your ideas about what happened in the First World War and referencing graves kind of helps me understand that a bit better.
But it came true in the United States.
But that's what's weird, because in America it was nationalism that defeated the Nazis.
Yeah, but by the time you get to the 70s and 80s, nationalism's bad. And
that's because of it went for the universities. What is it? Because of the philosophers? How did that happen?
It's the as I often tell my friends, we think it's a conspiracy, like taking over the universities, but it's much, much worse. It's a consensus. So no one has to coordinate. No one has to have a meeting. Hey, we're going to, nationalism, it's bad now. No, it's my professors, I in our Western Civ class, we didn't read Virgil's Aeneid. Why didn't we read Virgil's Aeneid? We read Homer, we read the Iliad, we read the Odyssey, but that's a book about an empire. That it validates empire. Bad book. Bad book.
Wow.
That's not an open society book. So it got dropped from the Western Civ in the 70s. Part of it was post-Vietnam, liberal professors saying that was just America trafficking and, imperialist activities.
Oh, I see. Vietnam must have had a big effect then in killing that off, killing the last vestiges of that.
But again, we're back to the thing. I always want to know, like you and I, we probably got bad DNA, proclivities to certain diseases, but like what triggers it? What? And so, yes, there's definitely Vietnam triggers something, but there's already something there. There's already a proclivity. There's already a tendency to always move in towards a more open. Open has prestige. It has prestige. And so the older professors had no capacity to stand in the way. Well, yeah, I can't really argue against that. We need more this. We need more diversity. We need more inclusion. We need all the DEI thing just traffics in the virtues of the open society. And so it's not why do ideologues want what they want? Well, their ideology dictates it. It's why does the society as a whole, why do they acquiesce? That's the more interesting question to me.
Am I right then in sort of understanding that you might say that these writers at the end of the war, like Popper, they were almost honorable and noble in the pursuit of course, never again, like this horrific thing that happened.
Indeed.
And so actually it's not necessarily like evil Popper, but it's more like he created this dichotomy and he made some mistakes. And so it's maybe the motivations behind it were honorable. That's sort of what I'm understanding.
I was born in 1959. And I believed the open society consensus when I was a university student. I read Popper in 1985 and made very favorable comments in the margins of the book. I reread it to write this book and had a very opposite reaction. So what changed? A lot of it depends on where we think the greatest dangers lie. A lot of politics is, again, it's metaphysical dreams, but also metaphysical fears. And, and I think that as I've through the 80s, 90s, and aughts, I've become increasingly fearful of, I'd say, disintegration. And not just disintegration socially, but personally. Like we have just terrible mental health crisis among young people. Like that's a kind of disintegration. And there's a kind of dispirited atmosphere, sense of fatalism, that we can't really do anything. We're all going to be swept away by climate catastrophe, or, nothing can really change.
Yeah.
And so this kind of, in the Christian tradition, we tend to think, pride goeth before the fall. And Western Christianity is very influenced by St. Augustine and treats pride as the cardinal sin. And pride is a kind of disordered personal sense of, that my desires and purposes and goals and ambitions and projects must triumph. I don't see that at all today. I see a different sin that in the Eastern Desert Fathers in the 2nd and 3rd century, they thought this was the most dangerous one. And the Greek word is achadia, and literally heartlessness, to be without a heart. So it's this dispirited feeling. It gets translated as sloth in our list of 7 deadly sins, which is not, I think, the right word, because it tends to connote laziness. But it really means something like clinical depression. Dispiritedness, inability to rouse oneself, a sense that there's no purpose, why bother? It's called the noonday devil. Afflicts the monk when the sun is hot. He's been doing his prayers. He's not making any progress in the spiritual life. He's getting hungry. And then the devil's whispering in your ear, this is pointless. Why are you doing this? This is a waste of time. This whole God thing is just an illusion.
And so I'm
So I think that's if I've grown increasingly concerned, we live in a loveless world, not that we live in a world on the brink of a kind of, totalitarian takeover. I mean, we can get totalitarian as we had it during the lockdowns.
Yeah.
And it was in the service
I would say Biden was pretty totalitarian.
Yes.
And I think
so. In the service of what?
A lot of it was in service of counter-populism and counter
maybe to keep the thing going.
Right.
But, as I say, lockdowns were all in the service of not dying. I'm all in favor of not dying.
Yeah.
But it's not worth living for. I mean, if my goal in life is not to die, I have a very thin and spiritless existence.
So, I mean, I see that as going back to Popper and lumping in religion into the...
He's an enemy of love.
He is an enemy of love.
Yes, because love is what rouses the soul. And his attacks on Plato, I think, if you go back and look at them, are ultimately attacks on, the great philosopher of love. That love is the great engine of illumination for Plato. Climb the ladder of love. And that's what draws us to contemplate the highest things. Love ennobles. Love also can debase. We can love debasing things. We can mutilate ourselves for the sake of things that we love wrongly and falsely. We can, even worse, harm or kill others in the pursuit of these base loves. And so I can understand why Popper, having lived through this terrible orgy of false and debasing loves, would become an enemy of love. But we live in a time when we've gotten way too much of that medication. And we need to renew the sources of love collectively and also personally.
I'd made a more sort of straightforward line to that. Let's say the quasi pseudo-religious nature of wokeism, of environmentalism, and even of the trans stuff. Because Schellenberger, you've done Michael Schellenberger's public show. He's articulated this well. Is that the trans stuff is almost like they created a soul. The gendered soul is kind of to replace the what the normal traditional religions had there. I'd made sort of more straightforward line that we killed God in this sort of more Nietzschean sense, and to have these fake gods trying to emerge because we need them instinctively. Human needs those.
Yeah, the first ones that came on the scene were strong and dark, and to expel them, we instead of instead
But
of critiquing them as idols, we went after the root, the spiritual impulse to have a God at all. So one way to destroy idols is iconoclasm. You create a society where it's impossible to have idols. But that iconoclasm is its own vice, its own temptation. Because iconoclasm really destroys everything that's beautiful. Everything that attracts the heart has to be destroyed. In Christian iconoclasm is we have to destroy the temptations of these intermediate goods in order to preserve our attention to the highest good. Problem is with the open society is that they don't even, it's not even that. It's, keep people from being passionate about anything. And I agree, the heart is not capable of living that way. Spirited people will find things to love. A lot of woke ideology is a kind of displaced effort. And you can sustain it because almost all the woke gods are in the interest of boundary breaking. So you can become if you will, a janissary of the open society consensus. A knight errant of the open society consensus, a crusader of the open society consensus. Go to Jerusalem, free Jerusalem, to honor Christ while slaying the infidels. I think it was a very alluring idea for the medieval knights to be able to go on the battlefield and be heroic and feel like you're serving the Prince of Peace.
Do you think that that's what George Soros was? Because George Soros studied under Popper at LSE. And
yes.
If you read...
Named his foundation after the Open Society.
Exactly. And writes glowingly about Popper through his books. Absolutely adores the man. And it seems that his whole worldview was built off that book and off Karl Popper. And he is the one who's sort of been funding a lot of the projects. Yes. And so, in a sense, he's carried that through. What's your take on George Soros?
We're all tempted, especially smart people, and George Soros is obviously a very intelligent man. It's very tempting to feel like you've got the key that opens the door, the one key. I talk about the Lord of the explanations, the one explanation to rule them all.
Yes.
And
the grand theory of everything.
And that's what Popper provided to George Soros.
And you're providing it to me through this book.
No, I don't think so. I hope not, because I hope this provides illumination to the present moment. But there are other factors, technological, birth control pill, other technological changes of mass media and so on over the last 80 years. Moreover, it's, as I say in the book, we're not experiencing, there are these big, like, Lord of the explanations. And Richard Weaver believes some of them. Nominalism, the root of all evil. The Reformation, the triumph of private judgment, the great acid, Descartes, Rousseau, liberalism. And I say, look, we are experiencing the aftermath of a tremendous historical trauma. And that it's not a crisis of liberalism. It's not a triumph of nominalism. It's not even the sort of, too many people have read Nietzsche. No, this is a historical moment we're living through, and it's going to end. And something else will take its place, and this will no longer be.
Very possibly. I mean, that kind of happened to Fukuyama, I guess.
Pardon?
In a sense, Fukuyama had a great theory about everything. And,
yes.
And now it looks rather silly, I'd say, or perhaps
because I think that I am arguing we have to encourage the return of the strong gods. We have to purify them with reason. We have to seek to nurture those that are noble, not those that are base. That's our duty. That's our responsibility in order to stem the tide of disintegration. My grandchildren are almost certain to condemn me for this project because it is bound to lead to excesses and it will also take on a life of its own.
Yeah.
And people will lose the balance. And, and I mean, I distinguish between the Heraclitean and the Parmenidean. Heraclitus, all his flux. Parmenides cling to that. He's the patron of permanence. Cling to that which is and cannot not be. And so you have two metaphysical dreams. One, flux, change. the other permanence, immobility. And I remember thinking we live in a Heraclitean age, flux, change, liquid modernity, as people call it. But I was in Poland and I gave a lecture that used this dichotomy. One of the older professors who had spent most of his life under communism said, too much Parmenides can be a problem too.
So what's your concern about the current movement, the current backlash against the open society consensus?
What's my biggest concern?
Yeah. Where do you think it might, where do you foresee it maybe going too far?
Oh, you get a kind of disordered preoccupation with the heroic manliness. I always think it's a great irony that people denouncing, the sort of weak and cowardly, doing so with anonymous Twitter accounts. But, gee, great manliness, you have to hide behind anonymity. So it's great spokesman of courage. Anyway, so we live in a very paradoxical time. But that's one area disordered. I think it's a correct impulse. In other words, I think that the restoration of the West is going to have to require a restoration of both male and female heroism, and they take very different forms. I think childbirth has historically been the great crucible of womanhood, because you talk about risking all for the sake of another. Now, people don't die of childbirth now as they did in the past, or at least not so frequently, but still, it's a great ordeal. And also, it's bringing into the world a great burden of responsibility, great joy, but also a great burden of responsibility. And war has been the typical crucible of manhood. And same thing. So it's to risk all for the sake of something greater than yourself.
There's something I think I disagree with that you said right at the beginning of this conversation I'd like to push back on, which is that you suggested that Karl Popper would be horrified about what was done in the name of open societies. And I'm not entirely convinced of that.
Yeah, maybe you're right.
And the reason I think that is because one of the most lasting ideas in open society, and it's his work, his books, is the tolerance paradox, buried deep in the footnotes. And he writes in that paragraph, one of the lines is, anyone who incites intolerance, that should be considered criminal. And I think that's really key, because it's not being intolerant, it's inciting intolerance in others. There's a key difference there.
I mean, in that definition, one could put pretty much anyone who holds traditional moral and religious views.
And people listening might also think of, for example, hate laws in Britain, a non-crime hate incident where if someone else perceives you to be hateful, even if you and the person on the other end of the hate, you can see how this has gone right. And I think that line has been unbelievably damaging and successful in people have really taken it on, and it's one of the key things from that book.
He said that, but I'm sure I'm pretty sure that the last 20 years of this sort of frenzy of cancel culture would have horrified him.
Possibly.
I think he was a liberal. He tried to theorize liberalism in this grand way, and I think that that's always a mistake. Liberalism is it's a habit of mind. It's a social tradition. I think when it's overly theorized, it becomes kind of a flesh-eating dogma, liberalism.
I was curious by
It's ever-changing.
Liberalism?
Yeah, I think so, because the protection of human dignity and genuine freedom is always changing because the circumstances of life are always changing. I mean, to be a liberal parent means something different when your child is 6, 16, and 60 and 36.
It also means something different in America and Britain.
Yeah, and rightly so. So I think my view is liberal always best functions as an adjective. You're a liberal Christian, you're a liberal conservative.
You're a MAGA liberal.
You're a liberal MAGA.
Liberal MAGA.
You're a liberal Brit, you're a liberal American, what have you. But that means that there's something that is protecting and softening in a due fashion these more primary and fundamental non-liberal loves. Because love is not liberal. Love is jealous. Love is ardent. You can love freedom, but even the love of freedom is itself, is not a liberal love. It may be the engine of liberalism, but it's not itself liberal as an experience. I don't think Henry David Thoreau or Ralph Waldo Emerson were liberals, however, but they were great lovers of freedom.
I'm curious by the influence that Popper had on conservatives after the war. So you mentioned Hayek after, but in your book you also talk about William Buckley, and it seems that there was a conservative version of Popperism, and I wonder, you might think I've gone too far in thinking this, but I would almost say that neoconservatism, particularly the idea of trying to install democracy on nations across the globe, might have been one of the bastard children of Popperism.
I don't think so.
Is that too much of a stretch?
I think that neoconservatism, people like Irving Kristol recognized that the Open Society consensus needed ballast. And so they were not opposed to it, but they were trying to renew the non-liberal sources of ballast, religiosity, moral traditions, and things like that. I don't associate neoconservatism as a foreign policy position. That's an attempt to make America the sort of global source of ballast. I think that that's a kind of bastard child of the 1970s neoconservatism. First Things magazine, my publication, was founded as a neoconservative publication. And the idea was not theocracy in America. No. We have a free, liberal polity that can only really endure and flourish if it's anchored in a pre-political moral and religious consensus.
It needs a metaphysical.
You need to have metaphysical anchors in order for liberal democratic society to function well.
Yeah.
And that was our do I believe that? I used to tell the founder of the magazine that he was a conservative liberal, whereas I'm a liberal conservative. I think it's true, actually. He kind of presupposed the Open Society consensus, I think, and wanted to, sustain it with ballast. Whereas I'm much more, no, actually, these primary loves, they're the center of all things, and we should soften them with a humane attitude when necessary, but never sacrifice them.
I know I was just in Washington, D.C. at the Jefferson Memorial, and I don't know, to be fair, too much about Thomas Jefferson, but I was struck by how much he appealed to God in his writings and his sort of, it seems that there is a metaphysical, even though people don't think of America as... He was a
deist.
He was a deist.
Yes.
And he had his doubts.
Yeah, his doubts about Jesus being the Son of God. In fact, I think he clearly rejected the doctrine that Jesus was the Son of God.
And he had his Jefferson Bible where he removed
all the supernatural
aspects.
Yes.
But he still appeals to the metaphysical.
Yes, I think so. And also natural right, that the moral fabric of the universe is there is a moral fabric to the universe. Mm-hmm. Certainly. I think that really and that's another thing too, is like there's this ancient skepticism and Epicureanism, the materialism, that's been throughout. That's a possibility always, and there's always been. But why does it suddenly become prestigious? I mean, like someone like Camus gets honored for essentially saying there is no meaning. And the question, well, what's going on there? I mean, I'm sure always people who suspected that was the case. But why? Because they saw him as laying the foundations for an open society. People need to be convinced that there is no meaning so that they'll be more pacific. If nothing is worth fighting for, no one will fight.
I wondered how much you think, and I guess my question is about to presuppose something that you might reject in the first place, but it seems to me that there's, a resurgence of Christianity, not necessarily that in attendees in churches, but we're seeing in the public domain more people openly professing a faith and even publicly sharing their conversion. Ayn Hirst Ali would be a famous recent example of
Yes.
of the new atheists, and she was a prominent new atheist, converting to Christianity. And I think new atheism fits into one of the bastard children of Popper,
Agreed.
to a certain extent. But given there's other prominent intellectuals, Jordan Peterson would be a good example of someone who doesn't necessarily explicitly say he's a Christian, but he's playing with Christianity in a way that to me implicitly implies a reverence to it, in a way that I think Popper might have rejected or not been so enticed by. I wondered if you thought that this new attitude towards Christianity is tied in with the populist movement, the energies, the spirit that animates the age.
Definitely. If you're treading water in a liquid world, it's exhausting, and the prospect of a solid bit of land is very appealing. And what could be more solid than the one true God? The unchanging, the eternal. So I think it's just natural that you're going to have a return. There will be a growing interest in not just in religion, but in what I would call hard religion, as opposed to soft religion.
What are soft religions?
Soft religion is, 60s, well, I'm spiritual but not religious. I'm just in Buddhism and, Zen meditation and things like that. And, that'll remain some element, but hard religion is more doctrines, Latin Mass, rituals, all these sorts of things. That something that's, like I say, that the anchors run deep.
Yeah.
And that is demanding.
The singer Nick Cave has a wonderful quote. He says that religion to him is spirituality with rigor. And perhaps it's the rigor aspect.
Yes. And it wasn't, didn't Tom Holland and who was it with Holland was on The Unheard?
It would have been Nick Cave, I think.
I think it was Nick Cave.
Yeah.
And it was about hard religion, the return of hard religion.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah.
And so I think that's very much a part of it. I think how far will this go? What will its implications be? I can't foresee.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I'm quite sure that the populist, faith, family, flag, the 3 Fs, that all 3 are going to see kind of renewal in the coming decade. And it'll be kind of interesting to see with Gen Zers and marriage and all that kind of stuff. I'd be kind of curious. But I would predict that there will be a growing interest in permanence, solidity, the hard and demanding, adamantine, unmoving, because as I say, we're drowning in a liquid world. So whatever's the opposite of liquid is going to be very attractive to people. And there will be, as I say, I've emphasized, there will be perverse forms of this.
Yeah.
But it's not just that the times are changing. My view is, no, actually, we should encourage this because, it is better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all, as a famous dramatist once wrote. That we're made for love. Societies without love are inhuman. Societies with perverse loves are human, sadly, all too human. And so I think we need to take the risks of perverse loves in order to restore the possibility of true love.
Do you think that, I think maybe this is very implied, but you're Anne Applebaum type, so wrong to think that Trump is a perversion, or do you have any problems with Trump as sort of riding the wave of what you've described, this kind of rejection of the open society consensus?
He's, I think, a kind of unreconstructed baby boomer patriot. I mean, that's kind of my sense of him. I mean, you could say that his judgments about what's needed for this and that policy could be misguided. And then his methods are hardly any method at all, to quote a famous movie. But I think the impulse or what he seeks is, I think he's elected because that's what's needed. The voters put him in office because they sense that he speaks about what's needed. So if you look at, I mean, I remember in 2016 the convention speech, he let what's this Texas Senator Ted Cruz, who was his main adversary towards the end. He had Cruz give a speech, and Cruz was like, it was Reaganism on steroids. He must have used the word freedom 100 times in his speech. Trump gives his acceptance speech in 2016. I don't think he used the word freedom a single time in his speech. He might have used the word liberty twice. And I was absolutely blown away. The Republican nominee for President of the United States in 2016 is not running on freedom. What's he running on? Wall, tariffs. And what is he telling the voters? I will protect you. And what kind of society have we created where the number one desire of ordinary people is to be protected? We've created a society where they're under assault all the time, economically, culturally, morally. I mean, they feel like everything is being torn apart. They have no home. They have no trustworthy place. They have no role. And, you know, I think I just was, in 2016, it's one of the reasons I wrote the book, as I went, wow, I will protect you. That's now going to be what will win elections in the West.
It's so interesting.
And walls, boundaries, borders.
Yep. Same thing's happening in Europe.
Yes.
And that's very much what Brexit was a part of, is reclaiming sovereignty and reclaiming borders, really. Immigration was the issue. So
the motif that I employ is reconsolidation. So we've been through a long spell of open society imperatives that all deconsolidate. Deconsolidate moral norms, deconsolidate national traditions, deconsolidate even borders themselves. And now we're in a period of reconsolidation. And will it go too far? Again, almost certainly.
Yeah.
And, it's your job, my job to, can we play a role in restraining the excesses of reconsolidation if we have no credibility as proponents of love and its concentrating power? I say no. So, we have to, I think, but we do have to think as participants in this populist revival. We do have to think about how do we purify, how do we guide this reconsolidating impulse, as opposed to standing outside constantly warning, oh, this is always a danger, it's illiberal, it's xenophobic, or whatever the standard open society motifs are. So I tell my staff at First Things, no, we're not going to go down that path. We can criticize. We got to criticize that these are false loves, not that they're loves.
It was curious to me to see that Ordo Amores was back on Twitter. J.D. Vance was having a fight.
Wasn't that something?
With Rory Stewart, who was a former Conservative MP.
Yes.
Now he's advocating for the Green Party, which is a communist party, by the way, in Britain. But that for me seemed to really fit into your understanding of things. That's the argument that's been had here, is for too long it's been the open society or Ordo Amores, now going back to the closed society Ordo Amores.
Well, the open society had no Ordo Amores. I mean, it was the Ordo Amores is a way of ordering your loves properly. It's a way of purifying them so that you don't love your family in a disordered fashion again, you don't become, if you will, idolater of your family. You recognize you also have a duty to your neighbors, and you have a duty to your nation. And of course you have even the highest duty of all, which is to God. And so having a sense of the proper order of loves is the way they guard against these idols of the nation, idols of the family, idols of the neighborhood, idols of your football team.
Yeah.
I think it's a good thing to love your Manchester United team. It's a good thing. Like human heart's made for that.
Yes.
It is very disordered when you're in fistfights with people from the opposite team.
Yes.
And fans from the opposite team. Surely your shared love as Britons is a far greater and higher love than the love of your local sports team. But we're prone to these disorders, and, it's our responsibility to try to, but typically what the Open Society consensus said, the problem is fanaticism, or the problem is that, we got to teach people to be inclusive and blah, 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 instead of teaching them that, no, this loyalty and this love is far more important, and it properly relativizes and subordinates this passion that you've developed as a teenager for your local sports team.
The obvious perversion of that is, let's say, Nazi Germany, where it's a love of their ethnic group and a rejection.
Right.
That's like again, now I'm playing the...
Yeah, and I think, Carl Schmitt theorized that, ultimately social unity requires enemies. And I think I think he's a product of a very materialist worldview. And I think, no, it's not true. Actually, shared loves unite people. They don't require enemies. They often do have enemies, but they don't require them. Like, my love of my own country does not require me to hate anybody else's country.
I don't mean to go all the way back to, but the interesting thing about nationalism, you're saying it is a negative. If you look up the word nationalism in the Oxford English Dictionary, it's literally written as a negative.
Yes.
It was so bizarre. That means there is a word missing for just patriotism isn't quite the right word. I think nationalism, unlike patriotism describes a habit of mind and a love. Nationalism is a program. It's an ism, I think, because it's a very modern idea. And I'm in favor of nationalism because it's a compensatory emphasis. It's a way of saying to politicians and policymakers that when in doubt, give priority to the national interest. When in doubt, give priority to restoring the national myth. When in doubt, give priority to reconsolidating the national character. It's an ism. And we've been through a long spell of anti-nationalism, not just anti-nationalism as the idea, but actual as a policy of disintegrating and deconsolidating the nation. Yeah.
So we need a compensatory return project. And, there'll come a point where the term won't be needed, it seems to me.
The term nationalism won't be needed at all.
Yeah, I think, you're right. If the populism winds up maturing into a governing consensus in the West, people may describe it as nationalist, but you don't have to be banging the table saying we need the restoration of nationalism, because it will have been restored.
Right. I see what you mean. Yeah.
And it'll become part of the natural DNA, just like people weren't running around saying, oh, we got to support the Open Society. Tony Blair in the 90s and aughts wasn't, because he could take it for granted, and then because most people really agreed. Everything would be better if things were more fluid, more open, more dynamic, creative destruction. You look at all the praise words of the last 30 years, they all turn on deconsolidation, liquefaction, border crossing, making things more fluid, dynamic, the very Heraclitus, change.
Yeah. The one topic we cover a lot on this show is censorship, and it's not for nothing that Schellenberger, our mutual acquaintance, is so interested in your work. There was a book by Gordon Allport written in the early 50s, and this is something explained to me by another guest on this show, Toby Young, who's head of the Free Speech Union in the UK.
Yes.
And he explained to me where all of the censorship in the modern day comes from, and philosophically. And he explains it came from Gordon Allport, who had this thesis, this pyramid in the early 50s with At the bottom, you have hurty words, and at the top you have Holocaust, and so that's why you have to censor everything. And for me, this fit totally in with your thesis.
Yes.
And this
never again.
Never again. It always comes back.
Which is a totalitarian principle, by the way. Never again. Right. I mean, in other words, anytime you try to eliminate the possibility of evil, you have to eliminate the possibility of being human. You're right. So, I mean, insofar, the new Soviet man, that was ordered towards this, fantastical utopianism, raise cattle in the morning and have philosophical discussions in the evening. Whereas the open society consensus tended towards, it had a kind of purely negative never again, right? You had the image of absolute evil, Auschwitz. And then you go down the pyramid, and you want to eliminate everything, any and everything that might lead to that absolute evil.
Which is everything.
Turns out
anything could.
It turns out.
You could
hypothetically, yeah, actually, of course.
Right.
So you've got to reprogram, little kids in kindergarten about how they talk about boys and girls. Because, if they're not properly inclusive at age 6, they could grow up to be totalitarians, fascists. Authoritarian Personality book that was published in 1949 here in the United States. It was this kind of pseudo social scientific study. It had a very important effect on.
Who's the author?
It's a series of authors, but the author or the figure that oversaw it was not Max Horkheimer, but one of the other Frankfurt School figures. And it basically, if you're
Adorno or something?
Yeah, Theodore Adorno,
yeah,
yes.
Okay.
But basically, at the end, if you have traditional moral views about sex and male-female relations, you're a proto-fascist. So that justifies taking children away from their parents, if they happen to be conservatively minded, and re-educating them.
Or last week in London, a toddler, aged between 2 and 4,
yes,
suspended from nursery for being transphobic.
Yeah, exactly. So there it is, 1949. And it does, I think it reflects this never again. And it's the same. It's this sort of weird inversion of utopianism. So you have this kind of anxious dystopian fear that winds up over-determining how you relate to society and how you relate to the foibles of human existence. And say in the United States, we have it's not Auschwitz, it's Jim Crow, racism, white racism against blacks. That becomes the
original sin of America.
And that becomes the never again. And then that's a justification for intervening in the most minute aspects of life. And it is a totality. So I think we can be hopeful that the populist surge, which is it's discrediting this never again mentality. During the last campaign cycle, we got Trump fascist, Hitler. But the establishment, the open society establishment, is at this point shooting blanks. And that's one way that a consensus dies, is that it amps up the volume, the Spinal Tap. Take it to 11, and the rhetoric of fascism and voters ignore you. That's a sign that the consensus is dying. The death throes are always dangerous, and so you can get situations like this toddler in preschool. But my guess is
because of overreach by the desperate last.
Yes. Yeah, they will become more and more desperate. Even throw a prominent politician into jail and cancel elections.
Who do they throw in jail? How are you referring to?
Marine Le Pen.
Oh, of course.
And then
I don't think she's going to be thrown into jail. She's going to have to wear a tag on her ankle for 2 years. And then
the fellow in Georgescu in Romania. Well, those strike me as this kind of paradoxical. We have to suspend democracy to save democracy.
We saw that so clearly in America before the last election.
Yeah,
lawfare on Trump and
right.
Various, was it Colorado and another state trying to take him off the ballot. It's kind of, to save democracy, we must completely undermine and ignore democracy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but these are the death throes of the open society consensus.
Yeah.
And I'm optimistic. I think that, I mean, the United States, our democratic system is actually functional. There were every effort to prevent him from becoming president of the United States again, and they failed, and the voters got what they wanted. He may succeed or fail as president. I mean, but the system worked.
Mm.
And, we're in the, there's all this exaggerated talk about violating constitutional norms. Well, this is all working its way through the courts, which is the way the system's supposed to work. And we'll see if Congress is able to legislate. We'll have this big tax bill coming up in the next few months. And then when it comes to foreign policy, I know Europeans are very upset, but it just strikes me that Trump is successfully destroyed the illusion that's been going on far too long, that we could have the kind of international rules-based international order is basically the open society scaled up to the entire globe. And, when Putin went into Crimea with no consequences in 2014, it was obvious that that was already kind of a dead letter. And so he's basically, he's tearing the bandage off the wound. Painful, but
Trump,
yeah, when it comes to international relations. And people say, oh, he's undermining our alliances. No, he's undermining the presumptions under the alliance system that we've had in place for a long time. But I don't see that those alliances changing. The effect is, I hope, will to encourage the return of the strong gods in Europe, and that Germany, France, Britain will be experience a degree of national revitalization of purpose.
Yes, that would also be my hope. My concern in that domain is that the strong gods of the West's adversaries see this as an opportunity to take advantage. If they read it, and I think after Signalgate, it seemed to me it wasn't just bluster. It wasn't just an attempt to encourage Europe to man up, which Europe should man up. They just haven't been,
yes,
and that's worked in Europe. But the Chinese, the CCP, the Russians see what's going on. They might be like, "Oh, this is a good opportunity to take more." And so I kind of wanted to go and talk about.
I agree. I do agree. It's a dangerous situation. But there was no. It's a dangerous situation, but we have to go forward. We couldn't keep doing what we were doing, because that would have just led to system failure. And so we have to change. And again, one could say, well, maybe maybe the current folks in the White House are not up to it. I'm open to that. But I think they're correct in assessing that we could not continue with the illusions that we were operating under. Which already the Biden people, did you read that big long piece in the New York Times about the war in Ukraine?
No.
A 20,000 word reported piece. You've got Lloyd Austin and Pentagon brass talking about a deal with Putin back in 2023. Meanwhile, the public rhetoric is supporting Ukraine's victory, whereas the sort of the hard-nosed folks were already reckoning with the fact that we're going to have to do a deal. So that's very corruptive of the. It's a huge coefficient of friction if you say publicly what you're actually not doing in reality.
Yeah.
And so Trump has said, no, we're not going to pretend anymore. This is the way things are going to have to be going forward. I think that ideally, Germany, Britain, France, they'll be much stronger, more cohesive as nations. Will make them less docile and servile. And that could create problems for American diplomacy. But the upside is that they'll actually be effective allies, and real allies, and not just vassal states.
We've talked and focused a lot on the West, and I guess how I want to sort of round things out is just your perspective on the strong gods of the non-Western countries.
They're strong indeed, aren't they?
They're strong indeed, and if you look at, let's say, India and China, one might think their strong gods have served them very well, because since the war, they've clawed themselves, they've yanked themselves out of poverty on mass scale. And I just wondered what's your sort of your insight was into the other strong gods of the rest of the world.
Yeah, Modi, his political success is undoubtedly tied to a rejection, not just among sort of Hindu masses, but among a significant sector of the elite. They look at what's happened to the West with the open society consensus as it gets to its decadent phase after the end of the Cold War and say, no, we don't want to go down that route. And so they emphasize Hindu nationalism as their strong god. I have no sense of what the native potential of India is. And the same thing with China. China is, I think, a little bit hobbled by the fact that it's so heavily westernized by communism. So you get the kind of rickety theoretical pretensions of Marxism with its relentless materialist understanding of the human condition. Like not a happy inheritance, actually, in the long run.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So, we in the West, it's interesting, at our point of dispiritedness and apparent crisis, the entire world has become westernized to an unprecedented extent. And so I look at this moment as an opportunity. So, I mean, like I said, China is fundamentally westernized by communism. And
if you take communism as a Western ideology, then.
Of course it is. Of course it is.
It is because Marx was a Westerner, a German, but his theory...
Secularized Christian eschatology, philosophical, left-wing Hegelianism, the same kind of techno-scientific, think you can crack the nut of society. And then, so the sort of Chinese Communist Party's technocratic notion that they can kind of manage their society only a person shaped by the West can imagine that. If Confucian view is that you have to inculcate the right virtues so that the wise homesman can guide, as opposed to breaking society down and figuring out how it works. And then hiring technicians to work the monitors and pull the levers. That always leads to system failure. So I'm not actually worried about China long term.
Do you think I'm wrong to think of Marxism as I mean, you've made the case there, but given, let's say, like one simple thing is that it's anti-religion, and so it's anti-Christian. And if you actually read Marx's work, he's very anti-Christian.
Right, to supersessionism.
So
the false religion is going to finally be superseded by the true science.
So it's a sort of anti, and in that sense, anti-Western.
No, I mean that's welcome to the paradox of the West, right? That's what we bequeath to the. I used to think, 10 years ago, I wrote something about how the United States was uniquely well positioned globally because we're the only society that can embrace liberal modernity and preserve religiosity. So why wouldn't we want to spread it around the world and just destroy the foundations of civilization for everybody else? Because only we seem to be able to keep the religious fires burning in our society. I'm not so sure. I'm a little too cocky on my part. Who knows what the future of Christianity is in
It has declined a little bit.
Yes, it has.
Yeah. And
as I say, we, this is before I thought I came to some realizations about where things were going in the West and having a deeper understanding of the open society consensus.
Well, we've discussed a lot, and there's even more in your book, which I highly recommend to
thank you.
viewers. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And before we close out, is there any ribbons that need to be tied? Any sentences that weren't quite finished that you feel like, or ideas that need rounding out, just to make sure that you're happy with what we discussed?
I think I'm a conservative. It's very easy to be despairing. Things look better now than they did when I wrote this book, but it's easy to be despairing. And I think it's really important for people to realize that there are threads of continuity in the West that remain very strong, and that the human spirit is very resilient, and that with the right sort of leadership, I do believe we can see a revival of national confidence, sort of spiritual depth, philosophical, metaphysical interest. And so I think we need to be careful that we don't have our own kind of conservative end of history, which is a negative, one rather than the Fukuyama positive one.
On that note, Rusty Reno, RR Reno, as people will find you online. Thank you so much for speaking to me.
Well,
of course, you're
me.
editor of First Things magazine.
It's not the worst magazine.
It's a very good magazine. Where can people find that, and where can they find you?
Firstthings.com. I'm published there all the time. When you're editor-in-chief, you always wind up saying yes to your own stuff.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Okay, great.
Thank you for watching the Winston Marshall Show with RR Reno. If you want exclusive content, remember, head over to winstonmarshall.co.uk. And if you want to support this show, all you have to do is press subscribe. If you do that, I can have more phenomenal guests like Rusty Reno exploring the issues you want to hear about and that the mainstream media won't touch. But until next time, be well.